Okay, so we are also going to be, I feel like I'm very loud though. Okay, we're also going to be talking about generalization, and we see this as a crucial form of memory involving retention of key aspects of experience while enabling a response to similar but not identical stimuli. And so we see this as the gold standard of learning. A learner registers something from their experiences, but then can generalize that to new information. And I see some nodding faces from other people who are interested in generalization. So I'm going to tell you about studies, and what I'm thinking of is two very different developmental periods: infants at 12 months of age and toddlers at 30 months or 2.5 years. And we're using different tasks, but what these tasks have in common is that they both have more redundant information and less redundant information. And so in these tasks, in order to generalize, children have to retain the more frequent information and ignore the less frequent information that in many circumstances like this are irrelevant. And so we are going to leverage sleep-wake delays to look at retention of these learning experiences that should lead to generalization. And what you're going to see is that we get identical performance in terms of no generalization on immediate test, but we get different effects of sleep versus wake on generalization in our different age groups. So our infants benefit from sleep, and our toddlers benefit from wake. So I have an explanation for this that I think is important and intriguing that I hope to convince you of. Let me just mention that our sleep-wake delays are over a 4-hour period. So we expose learners to an experience, and then they either stay awake for 4 hours and come to the lab later, or they sleep during that interval soon after learning. And the thing that's really interesting about the sleep of 12-month-olds and 30-month-olds is that it's in their naps, it's almost entirely non-REM. And that has been implicated in declarative memory retention in sleep in adults, and it's well understood in adults. And so I'm not going to show you any images or ERPs, but we've supported our work by a careful study of the animal literature and our best theories of how sleep contributes to memory formation. And so what I hope to persuade you of is that generalization stems from forgetting at both these developmental periods, but for very different reasons. Okay, so again, to just stress the similarities in our tasks, and I'm going to go ahead and go out on a limb and call my 12-month-olds pre-hippocampal and my 30-month-olds emerging hippocampal. And so we're exposing the 12-month-olds to an artificial language so we can expose them to something new, where they get the same pattern on every stimulus, but talker voice varies. And so we're finding that it prevents them from forming an immediate generalization. In our 30-month-olds, we are exposing them to a word learning task where the binding between the label and the shape of the new object is consistent on their learning trials, and it's more frequent than the less frequent contextual background that we have our shapes on and the color of our objects. Okay, so let's talk about the 12-month-olds first. So they have a learning phase where they're exposed to an artificial language, and then at test we measure their ability to make very fine discriminations based on legal strings from the grammar versus illegal ones. But importantly, the strings all are new. They've not heard these strings. And our dependent measure with infants is their listening time to the two different stimulus types. And this just gives you a sense of the language. It sounds like Ong Kumo, Erd Fingal, Alt Deech, Erd Kaisi. And so basically the infants have to learn that Ong and Erd go with two-syllable words, and alt and ush go with one-syllable words. So it's a pattern like they encounter in language where they have to combine words with X and Y elements with different characteristics. But at test, we actually have them, we have them generalize to new AX, BY combinations where the X and Y words are all novel. So this is the basis of the generalization. And so again, they have to discriminate legal combinations where A predicts X and B predicts Y from illegal combinations where A predicts Y and B predicts X. And so to manipulate less frequent and more frequent information, we expose infants to two talker voices, where each voice is associated with only half of the exemplars needed for generalization. We compare that to a one-talker case, where children are getting enough exemplars to form a generalization. And so let me show you the results on immediate test first. This gives you a sense of how we train the children. They're just sitting there playing quietly, and they're listening to this language in the background for about 12 minutes. And this represents the two talkers and short blocks versus one talker. And again, in the two talker case, infants are getting, one talker is associated with half of the unique X and Y elements that you need for a generalization. The other talker is associated with the other unique set, but they have to actually be exposed to the whole set of 6 to generalize based on our prior work. And so these are the results on immediate test, and I've got discrimination, listening time on the y-axis. And so what you can see is that if the exemplars are divided across talker, the less frequent information, infants are not discriminating, but they are in the one talker case. So now let's ask what happens with a delay. I've already given you the results, but here what we're looking at is the nap condition versus the wake condition. And so what you see is that infants are discriminating. They're listening longer to new legal strings compared to illegal ones if they sleep in the interval between training and test, but not if they stay awake. And so sleep, but not wake, promoted generalization, while wake did not change performance compared to immediate test. And so now I'm going to transition to the work with 30-month-olds using word learning. And this was work done when Denise Werchen, who just spoke about her lovely work on hierarchical rule learning, was in my lab before she departed to go to Brown to work with Dima and Michael. And Denise had the wonderful insight to look at word learning as a binding task. And that has just transformed the way I'm doing my research in terms of looking at multiple learning systems. And so what she was interested in is this problem of how learners generalize across different examples of a word where a dog is a different color in different instances and in a different context. And so in this case, the object label binding is the most frequent, the contextual background and the object color is least frequent. And so in her task that she developed based on some prior work in the literature, showing that actually at 2.5 years of age, at 30 months, children just cannot generalize if you change the context and if the context changes across learning trials. So her task goes something like this. Infants are exposed to 3 exemplars of a novel shape where you can see that the background color changes across trials. They hear, look at the DAX, look at the DAX, look at the DAX, 10 seconds each time, and then they get 30 seconds exposure to a distractor item. Look at this for 30 seconds. And then they get a 4 alternative forced choice test where they get a new DAX, the distractor object, a completely novel object, and a familiar object. And so chance is 25%. And look at what she found. We get no improvement with the nap, but a huge improvement with wake. And so here, wake, not sleep, promoted generalization of word learning, whereas sleep did not change performance compared to immediate test. And so here we've got a conundrum. We've got a case where neither developmental period is generalizing on immediate test. And so how is it that sleep permits generalization in infancy but prevents it in toddlers? And if wake improves in generalization in toddlers, why not in infants? What if the neural structures supporting memory development change across development? And so we've leveraged the ideas from complementary learning systems, an important paper that was published many years ago by McClellan, McNaughton, and O'Reilly, about 20 years ago now, that distinguishes between the properties of the hippocampus as a fast learning system that can learn with one trial, that binds objects and scenes. But recently, there's evidence that it also supports sequential learning in the kinds of tasks that we're actually using with our infants. And it's a later emerging system, which makes it exciting for looking at this transition between infancy and toddlers. And this is contrasted with cortical learning, where there are many trials required for learning, and it supports learning very early in development. So, what I want to point out to you, this is the medial temporal lobe and the connections that go into the trisynaptic circuit of the hippocampus. And so what I think very few developmentalists in the memory literature, in the early development, I'm not referring to the developmentalists here, are aware of is that this circuit doesn't actually begin wiring up. So the structures are in place early on, but the pathways, so you see information coming in from the entorhinal cortex, the pathways through dentate gyrus, the pattern separation properties of dentate gyrus, the pattern completion properties of CA3, and the output from CA3 to CA1, those pathways don't even begin wiring up until between 18 and 20 months of age, okay? So that opens a wonderful opportunity for looking at development. But the problem is, how do we do this? Because most theories predict the same outcomes with development, right? It gets better with development. Children remember longer, right? We know this from Patricia Bauer's work, from Roby Collier's work. But this is where sleep can be really useful for us. And this is because of what we understand about how sleep consolidates memories in adults. And that itself is based on very good neuroscience, imaging studies with adults and optogenetic studies with animals. So we are beginning to understand a lot about declarative memory formation and the role of sleep in that. So I'm just going to walk you through active systems theory. And so the idea is that when we have a learning experience, we're registering it cortically and hippocampally. And during sleep, there are processes that are orchestrated that involve slow wave oscillations, spindle activity, and sharp wave ripples. And these processes are implicated in the integration of these newly formed memories in neocortical stores. Okay, and there are imaging studies showing that you have a lot of activation immediately after learning, but after sleep, that activation begins showing up in cortical regions. And so, this is a candidate for some of the improvements we see. But importantly, for the ideas I want to share with you, neural replay plays a very important role here. And there's work in the animal literature showing that the cells that fire together during learning tend to fire together during slow wave sleep. And so here we've got an animal in one learning experience where cells are firing together here in space, represented by purple and blue. And so you can see during wake that they're firing together, and you're also seeing them firing together during sleep. And so then this is compared to another learning experience where now cells that are firing together are green and red during wake, and you're seeing them during sleep as well, okay? And so the difference is that, I mean, interestingly, these fire in the same order. During sleep, they're just more rapid. And something that's very critical here, and this is going to play a really important role for us theoretically, is that shockwave ripples are generated in CA3, okay? So, they're generated in CA3 and they play out in CA1. That's well understood in the animal literature. And so, although the naps of 12-month-olds and 30-month-olds have slow wave activity that's correlated with declarative memory formation and spindle activity that is as well, here's the problem. Wait, right? If shockwave ripples arise in CA3 and the efferent connections from CA3 to CA1 are not present, active systems consolidation cannot hold for pre-hippocampal children, right? So we don't think that the brain supports sleep-dependent active consolidation in these toddlers. But there's another theory that is somewhat productive for helping us understand what's happening in infants. And here, this is the idea that as we have our learning experiences during the day, we're potentiating our synapses, we're increasing the brain's need for energy, and the consequences are that you have a decrease in signal-to-noise ratio that saturates learning. And there's a downscaling process, a monoprotonic process that happens during sleep. And so here we see during wake, you've got synapses of different strengths represented by size, but the synaptic downscaling process acts to downscale monotonically so that it only leaves the strongest connections. So maybe you can see where I'm going here. This ties in very nicely to our ideas about how, and our stimuli that have stronger weights associated with more frequent information, weaker weights associated with less frequent information. So we're arguing that, that in prehippocampal 12-month-olds, the nap is actually benefiting from synaptic downscaling, where you're sweeping away the less frequent talk or voice information and leaving behind the more frequent pattern information. Whereas in toddlers, who do have the connectivity that's critical for active systems consolidation, what's happening with them is that they're encoding the strong and the weak information during learning, but they go to sleep and they're actually consolidating that. And so with wake, so they're strengthening that information that's not helping them, but during wake, they can actually forget the weaker information. Okay? Now, and this is a very nice way that Denise represented this. So what's happening during wake. So I just want to reiterate that we think that synaptic downscaling can explain why we get our sleep benefits, and that active systems consolidation explains why we get our wake benefits. And so I just want to wrap up very quickly. I think I've got about 3 minutes. Okay, I want to wrap up very quickly by just mentioning a happy note. We've been following up with these nap studies with our 30-month-olds, and if they have nighttime sleep, they recover their ability to generalize. What we don't know at this time is it the wake interval after the nap before sleep, or is it the REM properties of the nighttime sleep that aren't present in the nap that actually contributes to their later generalization. So parents don't need to be concerned about their toddler falling asleep after an ambiguous learning experience. But the very exciting thing for us is that because we don't have access to the imaging techniques that are so important for our work, we can actually leverage this emergence of trisynaptic connectivity and nap-wake delays to look at emerging hippocampal structure. And so I've now spent many months developing tasks that are actually continuous across these developmental periods, so I can begin to look at the signatures of pattern separation, context independence, sequential learning. And so those are the things that we'll be investigating in future work. And I think that this work has a larger significance for the field of cognitive development, because word learning is just one example of a task that involves the declarative memory system. And I'm just showing you some examples of variability. So here's a child who's precocious in word learning. So at is already showing what we call the word spurt at 11 months. And a child, well, let's see, it's just early on. I can't read this very well from here. I guess it's at 16 months, and then later on at 22 months. So I think that we can capture individual differences, and we're also very interested in individual differences in transitioning out of napping. And so we're finding findings that are very consistent with this story. Kate Newman-Smith yesterday presented some results with 6-month-olds, showing that learning is very fragile. After a statistical learning task, infants only remember for a short period, and sleep is not that instrumental. They remember just as well after wake for about an hour that is sleep. And Michelle Sandoval is presenting work this afternoon in the poster session showing that children who have just transitioned out of naps may mature well enough to do this, but they still need to sleep. So for very challenging generalization tasks, these children still, at 3 years of age, and most children are not transitioning that early, are still benefiting from sleep. So we think this is a public health issue as well. And if I can take a moment, can I just say one more thing that's relevant for the society? I'm a mid-career researcher, and I had a watershed moment about 3 years ago about the brain. And a few weeks later, applied to the Santa Barbara Cognitive Neuroscience Brain Camp and got in. And since then, I've been teaching my classes and sitting in on my colleagues' classes. And that's a hard thing to do when you have a busy teaching and advising schedule. And it's been difficult to find ways to get training. I have a sabbatical right now, and I'm spending my time at UC Boulder picking up some computational techniques to begin modeling the infant brain. But a semester is no time at all. And meanwhile, the funding at NIH for mid-career training has dried up. And so I think as a society, if we can brainstorm about ways to provide these transition abilities, I think that's critical as we recruit as more people show an interest in the brain, as they begin to understand how powerful it is. I think that could be extremely helpful for the growth of our field. So,
thanks so much, Rebecca, for that fantastic talk.